Aceto, the former CEO of CannTrust, expressed concerns for the company's corporate governance practices in a letter obtained by BNN Bloomberg dated late last year. He said the governance issues will need to be resolved. I fear that the performance of management and my performance as the CEO in particular cannot be properly measured or evaluated with the current lack of clear governance framework. For more, we're joined by governance expert at York University, Richard LeBlanc, who is a professor there. Thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Amber.
So at the heart of this is who knew what when, and to what extent did governance perhaps enable lax structures? And we're talking about a company that was growing marijuana in facilities that were not licensed to do so. When you saw that the CEO, incoming CEO, fresh on the job, had penned this letter saying, I'm really concerned here that there's no accountability, what was your initial take?
Surprise. It's a seasoned CEO. He comes from an American bank. He was a former chief risk officer. The letter went to the chair. The chair should have sent the letter to all directors, and I don't think that occurred. Apparently, emails are starting to surface. There are directors that knew about the illegal growing and did not act. They not only should have acted, they should have communicated with regulators, communicated with investors, launched an immediate investigation. And this was back in late 2018, and this is now August of 2019. So not only did these individual directors not act, they began selling shares, which is shocking. So this could also be insider trading. The Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington is investigating, so is the Ontario Securities Commission, and so is Health Canada. So the shares have dropped $10 to $2 and change. There's class action lawsuits. Am I surprised? I think the entire sector is getting a bit of a pass on its corporate governance.
The question, these issues were first brought to light by a whistleblower, and there are supposed to be parameters in place for whistleblowers. But I have to wonder if that would have even mattered if you had the CEO essentially blowing the whistle, not on this specific issue, because that wasn't referenced, but on the fact that there are vulnerabilities in the system that could potentially allow for something like this to happen.
Well, you rarely have fraud within a company with employees not knowing. So you want to provide a mechanism for employees, for bad news to rise and get right to the audit committee. And the audit committee charter of CannTrust didn't have a whistleblowing procedure. I think the employee ended up going directly to the regulator. So I tell boards, listen, you absolutely have to have a whistleblowing procedure. Don't assume that things are not going wrong in your company. And these are even mature companies, let alone an immature cannabis company. So the lack of proper reporting and structure. The other flaw I found was this former chair was the former CEO. He never should have been chair. Someone should have put up their hand on the board and said, well,
why is that? Illustrate that.
Because
what's a good governance practice?
You're not independent. You're the former CEO. In Canada, we want completely independent chairs who have never worked at the company, don't have relationships with other directors. We see, for example, a father, a wife, interlocks among the existing directors. So it's a very immature friends and family, and that's not what you want from corporate directors. So regulators, AGCO, the Ontario Securities Commission, they really need to look at the cannabis sector, because this is very soon with Trudeau legalizing cannabis, and regulators are catching up, companies are catching up, but investors are the ones paying the price.
You know, it's interesting, and you kind of touched on this earlier, that this is a sector that is still in its infancy, that got used to jumping 30, 40, 50% in a week. Did shareholders, you say they're bearing the brunt of it now, but were they perhaps complicit in this in the beginning, because they weren't asking those questions, they weren't forcing governance on these companies because they were doubling, tripling their money in a span of months?
They should be much more scrutinizing. When you go to an average cannabis company and you don't see who's on the board, you don't see their qualifications, you don't see who's independent, who's on certain committees, that's a red flag. And caveat emptor. So investors, I think, are going to become more sophisticated. We see this in other sectors such as gaming and AML. We have some soft sectors in Canada, cannabis included, where we really need to focus on the governance, because things flow downhill from there.
How quickly can governance issues be fixed?
It'll take a scandal. This qualifies. It'll take a major class action lawsuit, but it's really going to take regulatory focus. We're one of the few industrial countries in the world that hasn't reformed our governance guidelines since 2005. We're now almost 15 years old, so I think we need to refreshen our governance guidelines for
that
public
could apply then to any sector, not
exactly.
just cannabis.
Exactly.
Are
Yeah.
you seeing changes within the cannabis sector, however? Because, yes, this is being brought up with CannTrust, but this has been brought up at different points over the past year that you would think would be nudging them along.
Not really. When you go to the disclosure, you still see, if you peel back the onion, friends, family, acquaintances. So it's maturing, but they're kicking and screaming. So we really need a step change.
So any changes you have been seeing so far, you would perhaps
modest.
Characterize as cosmetic?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Richard, thank you so much for joining us with your insights.
My pleasure, ma'am.
That's Richard LeBlanc, professor at York University.